Hello, welcome to another Black Horizons program. We want to thank you for taking time out to join us again for another episode. Today we'll be talking about Zimbabwe. Ever since coming to power in April of 1980, Zimbabwe's Prime Minister Robert Mugabe has appealed to popular imagination by making sallies against Zimbabwe's colonial legacy. This legacy, among other things, bequeathed the new nation dangerous economic disparities between whites and blacks and a potentially explosive political future. Mugabe's efforts so far appear to have won him positive popularity and sympathy in Zimbabwe's political realm. In today's program, the first program in our two-part series on Zimbabwe, we'll look at Zimbabwe 3 years after the present elected government assumed power from the illegal white minority regime of Ian Smith. I have joining me on today's program Bruce Sithole, a chemistry student at Dalhousie and a citizen of Zimbabwe, and also Gordon Roberts of the School of Business Administration at Dalhousie. Gordon and his wife Nancy have just returned from a 6-month stay in Zimbabwe, where Gordon was on the teaching staff of the University of Zimbabwe teaching business. Bruce and Gordon, welcome to the Black Horizons program.
Thank you.
First of all, Bruce, I wonder if perhaps I could ask you to acquaint our viewers who may not be that familiar with the geography of Africa with just where Zimbabwe is located, and perhaps ask you to give us a little bit of background about Zimbabwe, its peoples, its different language groups, and so on. You've brought along a very colorful map here for us, and if we can get that situated on our monitor, perhaps you could just locate Zimbabwe, first of all, in relationship to the rest of Africa.
Okay, thank you. Zimbabwe is situated in what we call Southern Africa. As you can see on this map here, it's bordered mostly by about 4 countries. You have on the south, you have South Africa, on the north, you have Zambia, on the east, you have Mozambique, and on the west, you have Botswana. So it's sort of in the subtropical region of Africa. Mm-hmm. And the size of Zimbabwe is just about 150 square miles. Well, I'm sorry, I'm still thinking in the old units anyway. It's about 150 square miles in area-wise. And
do they have the metric system in Zimbabwe? I haven't been able to make the conversion. Is it metric in
yes,
Zimbabwe?
Yes, they do. They do have metric system.
Yes.
The coordinate metric system. Now, the outline of the population, in fact, there's been a recent population census in about August last year, and it's said to be just under 8 million people.
8 million.
8 million. And of those, probably about 200,000 to comprise whites, and the rest comprise of blacks. And within the blacks, you have several different tribal groups. The main group is called the Shonas, yes, which speak Shona people. And these are mostly spread around this most parts of the country, all about this region here, going onwards. That's mostly the Shona people.
Be the northeastern part of Zimbabwe.
Yeah, up to the northeastern part of the country. And then you have the minority tribe called the Ndebeles or the Mandebeles, and these are mostly in the sort of the western part of the country, southwestern part of the country here. And then you have some very minor tribes, say, for example, you have the Vendors down here, and they also have the Tongas on the part here. Right. But the major group here that the Shonas, who make up 80% of the population, and the Ndebeles, who make about 20% of the population.
Right. Now, at Salisbury, this area, would this be more of an urbanized area than, say, this southern portion of Zimbabwe, or is this both urban and rural in this particular area?
In fact, what happens is, okay, by the way, the names have changed since independence.
Yes.
It is now called Harare. So
right.
This is quite an urban area. In fact, Harare is quite a big city. It has a population of about 600,000 people.
Yes.
So it's mostly urbanized. And then the surrounding parts, that's where the rural areas, that's where you find most of the people living in the rural areas, especially right. The blacks and the
right.
Africans. Right, yeah.
Is there any other major population center?
Here you also have Bulawayo here too. This is about 250,000 people. You also have another one here, Gweru, that's about 110,000 or so. And you also have here Mutare, also about 100,000 people there. So those are the really major big centers in terms of urbanization.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Bruce. I think that perhaps will help our viewers locate Zimbabwe and tell them just a thumbnail sketch about the geography of the country and the principal peoples and so on. I mentioned in the introduction that independence came to Zimbabwe in April of 1980. before we talk a bit about what's happened since then, I wonder if I could ask you in a very brief kind of way to just sort of give us some idea of what the situation was like in Zimbabwe just prior to independence. What were conditions like in a brief overview?
Okay, prior to independence, things were really hot, quite hot really in terms of how things were, what situation was, and so on. What happened was there was a white minority government led by Ian Smith. Ian Smith, he seized power by force, especially in 1965 when he declared UDI. So from there on, he pursued a policy of where he felt that the whites were superior to the blacks, and therefore his government was trying by all means to suppress black aspirations and all that. So of course, the blacks wouldn't take that sitting down. So that's most of the black leaders and so on, they formed the guerrilla groups and so on, who operated in bases from the surrounding countries, which are surrounding Zimbabwe. So from that time, the owners, there was quite a big, bitter armed struggle to try to defeat the white regime of Ian Smith and all that. So prior to independence, then we have a situation where there was sort of a white pitted against black. You had a situation whereby whites lived in separate areas, blacks in separate areas, people of mixed race in separate areas, Indians in separate areas. They were not allowed to meet in any way. So it was quite this.
Very much an apartheid.
Yeah, quite an apartheid system. Yeah, it was. That's how things were in that time. And of course, with the blacks, I mean, most of the economic infrastructure or everything was held by the whites. The blacks were mostly just there to provide cheap labor for the benefit of the whites. Yeah.
Right. Well, in program 2, we're going to spend some time talking about the economics, the social-economic situation of the Zimbabweans. Could you tell us a bit about the process that was used that brought about independence in Zimbabwe, and a bit about the elections and the outcome with Robert Mugabe being chosen as the Prime Minister of the country?
So, okay, prior to independence, there were two main guerrilla groups which were fighting for independence. One was led by Robert Mugabe, called the ZANU group, and the other was led by Joshua Nkomo, called the ZAPU group. So these two groups were the ones which did most of the fighting for independence to try to defeat this regime and so on. So the war intensified until in the long end, Ian Smith, well, by that time anyway, he had put a puppet regime under Bishop Abel Muzorewa to run the government. So at that time they were forced to come to negotiate with the guerrilla leaders and so on. So beginning in 1979, there was a conference called the Lancaster House of Conference, arranged by Britain and partly by the United States and some other groups, whereby all these factions, all these warring factions came together in London to try to hammer out a settlement or an agreement towards peace and all. So towards the end of 1979 and so on, they agreed that there was going to be free and fair elections, and whoever won the elections was going to run the country and all. So the elections then were held then in April, in fact in March 1980, and during the elections, of course, there were many different parties which were running. One party was led by Robert Mugabe, another was led by Joshua Nkomo. Ian Smith fielded his own candidates, Bishop Abel Muzorewa his candidates, Sithole his own candidates, so there were quite different parties running on. But what emerged was that Mugabe's party was victorious, winning 57 of the 100 seats in the parliament. By the way, in the constitution which was drawn up, the constitution was drawn up such that the whites were guaranteed 20% of the seats, and then the blacks had to fight for the other 80% of the seats in there. So as a result, at independence, Mugabe had 57 seats, Ian Smith had 20 seats, and Joshua Nkomo had the rest, which was about 26 seats, and Muzorewa had about 2 or 3 seats.
Right. Were you in the country at the time of the elections?
No, I wasn't in the country. I was over.
Well, I'm sure you must have been monitoring the situation very closely. Were you at all surprised by the outcome?
Outcome of the elections.
Outcome of the elections.
Yeah.
Yes.
In fact, I was surprised. Well, first of all, I was surprised at all that there was going to be elections in the first place. I didn't expect them to happen so soon. I would expect it would have taken about maybe 50 or more years before this whole thing came about. And also, I was surprised that Mugabe won. Well, not surprised in that sense, because I knew he was going to win, but I didn't expect that he was going to be allowed to win as such, because since most of the whites, or even South Africa and other people, considered him to be a Marxist, a radical Marxist and so on, they didn't want him to be in power. So I would expect that maybe they would have tried to prevent him winning anyway and so on. In fact, they tried even before the elections. There were about 3 assassination attempts made on his life, but it didn't happen. So when he won elections, obviously, to the black men in general, it was no surprise. It was quite something expected. Yeah.
But he certainly did get an overwhelming majority in terms of support from the Zimbabwean people, given a very clear mandate to govern. Since assuming office, of course, he has not been without his opposition. I think the opposition has come from several sides. Joshua Nkomo certainly has been very much a thorn in the side of the administration there. We're going to talk a little bit later about Ian Smith and his party, and both South Africa and some of the other reactionary forces who've tried to destabilize things. But I've been very saddened by the situation involving Joshua Nkomo. He's been known to us as sort of the father of the liberation movement in not only in Zimbabwe, but he's been very prominent in liberation movements throughout Africa. What is your assessment of the situation involving Nkomo? Does he have you been surprised by the developments of late? Just recently, as last week, he was detained by the government, and he's been involved in some very bad situations vis-a-vis the government.
No, I wasn't surprised really by the situation in Nkomo. Maybe I might just go back a bit back in history to give a viewpoint about Nkomo's situation. Of course, Nkomo was the father of Zimbabwean politics. He's one who started the whole idea of a nationalist movement in Zimbabwe. But what happened was when the blacks decided to fight for their rights, Nkomo sort of chickened out. He didn't want to go for armed struggle and all that. Therefore, as a result, there was a breakaway faction from the party he had formed by the radicals who believed that they could only achieve independence by armed struggle.
Yes.
Therefore, they formed this ZANU party from the original ZAPU party. And then during the armed struggle, when the people were fighting against the white regime, it so transpired that Nkomo had some dealings with Ian Smith and South Africa and so on.
Yes.
When he was based in Zambia, he had some back dealings with Smith. So as a result, from this time onwards, most of the black people had a mistrust of him. They didn't like him because they knew that he was somebody who had some back dealings with the whites and all that. But then, coming at the independence, when Mugabe won independence, he decided to invite him to government, to form a government with him. He didn't have to, but in fact he decided to invited him over. At the beginning, he offered him the presidency, but of course Nkomo refused, didn't want that. And in the end, he was given the post of Minister of Home Affairs. But after a while, there was squabbles between Nkomo and Mugabe and so on. The most serious of which was that it was found that Nkomo or else his aides or his supporters and all that, they hid arms caches all over the country and so on. What happened was they had some arms stored in Zambia during the war. So after the war, these arms were transported into the country, and they hijacked the train and hid all these arms all over the country and all that. So I guess therefore there was a fallout between Nkomo and Mugabe because of this situation, because Mugabe suspected that Nkomo was hiding these arms in order to stage a coup d'etat against Mugabe. So as a result of this, Nkomo was expelled from the cabinet, and that's where most of the troubles began there. And with him splitting off from the government, some of his people were, of course, were not too pleased about it and so on. Some who had joined in the National Army and so on, a few of them, they left the army and then resorted to terrorizing the people to try to sort of a revenge, or I don't know what they are trying to achieve in that situation and so on. So what has happened is that Nkomo is out of the government because of the government suspecting that he was trying to stage, say, a coup d'etat against him and all that. And now his supporters, of course, are displeased about this whole thing. And as a result, they are going about now trying to make things ungovernable for the governing country and so on. But all this only is happening only in their own home area, which is around the Bulawayo area. So what they do, really, they are only terrorizing the people around there to try to...
Right. What percentage of the ZAPU party would you say would be still supporting Nkomo? It appeared for a while that there were those in his own party who dissociated themselves from Nkomo when it became apparent that he was involved in trying to destabilize the government and so on. Would you say the majority are with Nkomo, or is his support base minimal?
I'll say probably the majority of his people still support him, especially the elderly people or in the folk and so on. Yeah, they could still be supporting him, I guess. But in the parliament, there were some people who who appointed cabinet ministers and so on. And when Nkomo was fired from the government, those people, some of them refused to resign from the government and they continued on in the government. So, but all in all, I would say quite a big proportion still support him anyway.
Right. Well, Bruce, I want to pass over to you and talk a bit about Ian Smith and the Republican front. I guess it's no secret that Ian Smith certainly is no friend of Robert Mugabe and his government. But I guess there's been some very interesting developments with respect to Ian Smith and his party. There have been some defections, have there not, in his party?
Yes, that's right. 2 or 3 former members of his party resigned from the, well, they now call it the Republican Front, formerly the Rhodesian Front, and have become ministers in the ZANU government. And I think this reflects the views of many of the white people who, while they weren't pleased about losing power, are somewhat resigned to it and trying to see what they can do that's positive within the framework of the present government.
What would you say, you were there and you had a chance to observe the situation firsthand, would you be able to give any kind of indication of just how the division, where the situation is with the white community there? How many are sort of still supporting Smith and how many are perhaps a little more, leaning a little bit more towards Mugabe for whatever reason?
Well, it's really hard to assess people's motivation, but looking at what they tell you while they're complaining bitterly about how tough life is. Let me just set the scene. You're sitting beside a swimming pool on a 1-acre estate, enjoying drinks or playing tennis on a private court, and people are complaining about how tough life is for whites in Zimbabwe. So that this life is really quite good for them, but I think that the government is bent over backwards in order to try to keep the whites in the country because it's felt that their skills are needed in the short run to keep the economy going. So that they've been able, with the exception of having power, they've been able to keep their cars, their servants. They have to pay them a little bit more now, but it's still very little. Their swimming pools and most of their other perquisites. I think, though, that it wouldn't take much, perhaps 1 or 2 major upheavals, to make about 90% of them think about leaving the country. So in short, I think they're staying there as long as things go well, but they don't have a long-run commitment to Zimbabwe.
What about Ian Smith? Is he any kind of significant threat to the government of Robert Mugabe, in your opinion?
This is hard to say. As you perhaps recall, during the time that I was there last fall, Smith was in the States and he made some very negative remarks about Zimbabwe, and when he returned, they took his passport away, which I think was remarkably lenient reaction on the part of the government. If you recall that when Smith was in power, most of the people who are in the government now are either forced into exile or into detention. How much of a force is he? Probably as an individual. His day has passed. He's an old man and he has health problems. Yes. But there have been some incidents in which white officers, Air Force officers, have been charged. I don't know what the evidence is, but they've been charged by the government of participating in sabotage, blowing up 1/4 of their Air Force. I was just sitting there on the ground. So I think there are some whites who are still trying to go back to the bad old days.
Right. What kind of evidence did you see or do you know about in terms of linkages between with South Africa and the white community there? Certainly, again, South Africa would be no friend of the Mugabe government. What kinds of opposition are they mounting? What kind of trouble are they causing for the Mugabe government?
Well, a lot of the whites have links with South Africa or relatives in South Africa, and this is where they go when they think of leaving the country. But to focus on your question on the political scene, again, during the time that I was there, South Africa sends sabotage expeditions into the country. One such group of 3 white former Rhodesian army people were captured or actually killed while they were in combat with the Zimbabwe army in the southern part of the country that Bruce was pointing to before. And South Africa, after some hemming and hawing, admitted that they were responsible for this. Where devastatingly, even on the eastern border with Mozambique,
Yes.
they have cut off the oil supplies which come to Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe, of course, as we saw, was a landlocked country, so it's dependent on oil supplies from the ports in Mozambique. They've effectively blocked this pipeline, so much so that at the time of the spring plowing, which there, of course, being in the southern hemisphere, would come in December, at the time of the spring plowing, there was virtually no gasoline at all to be had in the country because the little amount of petroleum that they could get in had to go for diesel fuel for the tractors. So they've caused a lot of problems for Zimbabwe. Their policy is to destabilize the government.
Well, now, when we think of opposition, of course, we've just been discussing some of the obvious opposition that one would expect to see in South Africa, but perhaps another area that we should touch on is this whole question of the foreign policy of countries like Canada and the United States. What is your assessment of Canadian and U.S. foreign policy with respect to Zimbabwe?
Well, starting on the personal level, while I was in Zimbabwe, I was sponsored by an arm of Canadian foreign policy, and the Canadian government is engaged in various aid projects around the country to the university, in the rural areas, medical and so forth. The U.S. government, I think, is the biggest single donor to Zimbabwe. So in this formal, upfront way, they're being very generous. I think on the deeper sense, in the political sense, I personally would have to raise some questions about the role, especially of the states, because, as you know, the Reagan administration has been very positive in support to South Africa, and the South Africans have been doing everything they can to destabilize Zimbabwe. Now, of course, Canada doesn't make U.S. foreign policy, but as far as I know, the Canadian government has done nothing to protest against this policy that's being carried out by the states.
So maybe a form of support that's benign, but nonetheless very, very devastating in terms of its impact. We were talking a moment ago, and you touched on the situation vis-a-vis the relationship between the two communities in Zimbabwe, the blacks and the Caucasian members of the community there. I want to go back to you, Bruce, and ask you, there were those who thought that the whites would leave Zimbabwe when Mugabe took over. I think South Africa has gone on record as wishing very much that there would be some kind of civil war, perhaps, that would take place in South Africa. But yet, we haven't seen either of those two things take place. In your view, how has Mugabe's program of national rapprochement, I suppose you might call it, or national reconciliation, I think has been referred to, how has it worked? How you were there, I think, last summer. Have you seen any differences in the relationship between the black community and the white community?
Okay, the thing is, as I said, before independence, right, the whites were living in areas called suburbs, right, and the blacks were living in different areas, so there was no way with this they could interact and so on. Right? Now, after independence, of course, there are no more racial barriers. People can move anywhere where they want to and so on. Now, but what has happened is that at least it's mostly the affluent blacks who have managed to move into what they formerly white areas and so on, where they moved into these areas and so on. So, I mean, there's been some changes anyways since independence in terms of the attitudes and all that, yeah. But basically, I'll say quite a number of the blacks, they still feel that at least Mugabe has appeased more the whites so than the blacks in terms of changes, what have taken place since independence and so on. I guess the point is Mugabe, I mean, he has to try to maintain the economy, help develop the economy and so on. And of course, whites are very important in the development of the economy and all that. So he doesn't want to do anything which will scare them off or make them live en masse and all that. So he's really working on a tightrope, really. Because what happened during the war, quite a number of blacks were displaced by Ian Smith, by his policies and so on. And now these people have to be resettled and fed and given places to live and so on, yes. And of course, the government has no money anyway to resettle these people and all that. So there's quite this big problem of trying to help the blacks and all that in this place. So most of the benefits, I would say, have gone mostly to the educated blacks and all that, because at least they've moved in higher up in terms of jobs. They've replaced the whites who have left, or they've been now being trained for better jobs and all that too. So at least with those things have been better for them and so on. But for the ordinary men in the streets, things are not all that too good. But at least for the working people, it's not too bad either, because at least the government has instituted a minimum wage for
Yes.
everybody, at least, so that at least now they've much better buying power than they had prior to independence and all that.
Right. Well, Gordon, I think I could infer from the comments you were making earlier that there hasn't really been any change in attitude of the white community there towards the blacks. It's more, I suppose, an accommodation that has taken place. Would that be fair to say?
That's a good word, that people are flexible. They realize, or most of them realize, that there's nowhere else in the world that they could go and live as well. Even though, as Bruce said, and I agree with him, it's very positive the way the minimum wage has been raised. Still, the servants in Zimbabwe would get about the equivalent of 80 Canadian dollars a month is the minimum wage.
Mm-hmm.
So many of the whites or people in my position at university, professors, would have 2 or 3 servants living right on their property, working for them 6.5 days a week. So they don't want to give that up, but I don't think their attitude could change, because it's taken them a whole lifetime to develop the type of attitude that they have toward the black people.
Right. In your opinion, has Mugabe, does he deserve any praise for the way in which he's managed the diverse groups in the country, or what is your personal assessment of that situation?
I have great admiration for Mugabe, and I think this is shared by almost everyone in Zimbabwe, including the members of the white community, because he is a diplomat, a man who has been able to keep a government going in what many of his opponents hoped would be an ungovernable situation. The government has brought in positive changes for the man in the street, as Bruce was mentioning. And in addition to the points that he was discussing, there's also education. Education is now free, and children in the rural areas are going to school for the first time. The black people can go around the country without being harassed or by the white racialist army. All these things are very positive under the new government. But I think the big issue is, where are the economic benefits for the black man who lives in the rural area? And how much longer is that man and his family going to wait and be satisfied with the things that have come so far?
Mm-hmm. Well, we're going to talk about that a bit more in our second program. In the closing minutes of today's program, Bruce, what is your assessment of Mugabe? Is he generally supported by the average Zimbabwean? What do you personally feel about Mugabe?
I feel that at least Zimbabwe is lucky to have a person of Mugabe's caliber in position of power and so on. I think he's done quite a good job, really, in terms of, under these hard times, under these difficult conditions, that he has managed to keep the country stable and almost in control and all that. Yeah.
You feel your view is generally shared by the average Zimbabwean?
Most people, I think that's the view they have. Yeah.
Right. Well, gentlemen, we've exhausted our time for today's program. I want to invite you back next week when we'll continue with part 2. Restructuring an economy where there are major economic disparities between whites and blacks, as we've been discussing in today's program, is certainly no mean feat. Next week, in our part 2 of our series, we'll look at some of the specifics of Zimbabwe's National Transitional Development Plan and the progress achieved to date by the Mugabe government. That's our program for today. We want to thank you for watching. Join us next week. Hello, welcome to another Black Horizons program. We want to thank you for taking time out to join us once again. Today we will be continuing our discussion of Zimbabwe with our second part of our two-part series on Zimbabwe. The restructuring of an economy where there are major economic disparities between whites and blacks as a result of many years of colonialism is no mean feat. Although Zimbabwe's economic performance in the first 3 years of its independence must be somewhat gratifying to Prime Minister Mugabe, the basic reforms necessary to disentangle the economy from the stranglehold of the minority white community and multinational corporations surely must be causing some anxious moments for Prime Minister Mugabe. In today's program, our final segment of our two-part program, we'll look at the progress which has been achieved to date by the Mugabe government. I have joining me on the program Nancy Roberts. Last week, your viewers will recall, we had her husband Gordon Roberts on the program. This week we have Nancy with us. Nancy, along with her husband, as we mentioned last week, spent 6 months in Zimbabwe. While there, Nancy studied history at the University of Zimbabwe. Also, we have back with us once again Bruce Sithole, a chemistry student at Dalhousie University and a citizen of Zimbabwe. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Bruce, many of our viewers this week would have seen in the Chronicle Herald reports of alleged killings that are taking place in Zimbabwe. These killings, it's been suggested, have to do with the different racial groupings in Zimbabwe. I wonder if I could have you, we touched on this a little bit last week in our program in our opening remarks, but I wonder if I could have you once again just clarify the situation with respect to the two main grouping of people in Zimbabwe and your assessment of the reports. I realize, of course, that you don't have, it's been a recent thing and you perhaps don't have all of the facts, but I'd be interested in getting your assessment as to what you believe has really taken place there. The government suggests that the killings haven't been anywhere on the scale that has been suggested, and on the contrary, others have suggested that there have been a lot of inappropriate action on the part of Mugabe's troops. Could you perhaps just tell us something about the background of this incident?
Okay. As I mentioned last week in this program, in Zimbabwe, within the African population, there are two dominant tribes or two dominant groups. The major one being the Shona tribes, which make about 80% of the population, and the other one is the Ndebeles, which make about 20% of the population. And this Ndebele group, they live mostly around the western part or southwestern part of the country in the region. And in this part of the country, that's where the six tourists who were visiting Zimbabwe were abducted late last year in Zimbabwe. So now this part of the country, that's where Joshua Nkomo has most of his backing. That's where most of his people come from and so on. And as we said before, since Nkomo has been ousted from the government and so on, his supporters, which means people mostly from this area, have been trying by all means to try to disrupt the government. Or in fact, there have been quite a number of cases where government agents or government people visited the country to feed the people who have been killed by the dissidents movement in the people area. Now, as a result, of course, the government is under pressure in order to combat this problem, to overcome this terrible problem in the situation in the country. So most probably, I believe there could have been some atrocities. There could have been some civilians killed in the crossfire between the soldiers and these armed guerrillas. But I don't believe that the casualties could be that high. Some reports were saying 3,000, some were saying 1,200, some were saying some figures in between there and so on. My personal belief that, I do believe there could have been some civilian casualties, but I don't believe there could be that much higher, really. That's how I believe.
Right. Well, this area, as you've mentioned, is a Zappo area, and of course we know that Nkomo was just recently detained from attending a conference overseas. Do you think that perhaps the overstated, or what may be overstated incidents might be a propaganda thing on the part of Nkomo and the Zappo to try to discredit the government?
Oh yeah, I do believe so. I think it's mostly a propaganda affair because of course, it will be quite a big advantage to Nkomo if he can discredit the government by all means possible to them. So most probably it is just only a PR exercise on part of the Zabu people. Mm-hmm. At least, if they could produce the evidence or so, maybe. Because I remember about some time ago when there were some such casualties, at least Nkomo would take or his people would take some journalists and to go and see this area and so on. But this time they haven't done this. So at least if that was true, they could be doing the same thing too. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll have to wait and see what time tells us about the incident to see whether or not you're right in your assessment. Well, Nancy, I want to pass over to you and ask you, from your 6 months of experience in Zimbabwe, what's your assessment of the economic performance of Zimbabwe since independence? What did you observe about the economy generally of Zimbabwe during your stay there?
Well, the first thing that struck us, moving to the capital city, was how little evidence of change there was. A bustling city with all the amenities of Halifax or even Toronto.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that could be taken to be symbolic of the economic performance, that it's provided a sigh of relief to the white Zimbabweans and the foreign capitalists, and at the same time a small amount of relief to the black Zimbabweans. The big sigh of relief by the whites and the foreign investors would be that inflation seems to be kept under control. It's certainly no worse than in many other parts of the world, and much better than many parts of the world. There are various economic measures taken that seem to keep businesses going. The mining sector is in bad shape because of the recession worldwide, but the government is, helping to bail them out by buying in many cases. So I think the overall picture is that Zimbabwe has remained stable, and foreign capital has grounds for hope.
Mm-hmm. Well, I came across, Bruce, an interesting quotation that was attributed to Prime Minister Mugabe. I suspect he may have made this remark when addressing some of the businessmen that Nancy's been speaking of. I don't think he probably would have made this statement in the rural areas of Zimbabwe, but in any event, it's alleged that Mugabe said that we recognize that the economic structure of the country is based on capitalism. And whatever ideas we have, we must build on that. Modifications can only take place in a gradual way. I'd like to get your assessment of what you consider to be the implications of this for the average Zimbabwean. Do you think that this is an indication that Mugabe is not going to address some of the basic economic reforms that are going to be necessary to have a redistribution of income in Zimbabwe? Or was this a purely political statement made to a selected audience?
Well, it could have been both, but I guess the main point is Zimbabwe, at least, is the breadbasket of Southern Africa. Many countries, especially countries like Zambia, Mozambique, even Zaire and Tanzania, they depend on food supplies from Zimbabwe and so on. And of course, at independence, or even soon after independence, most of the food was being produced by the white farmers and so on. Therefore, it's quite imperative on Mugabe's part to maintain the present situation as it is, to be able to feed these other countries, yes, in addition to feeding Zimbabwe itself and so on. So as a result, he can't just try to change things as quickly as possible as he can, because if he does that, then he scare off all these white farmers, and then the economy will collapse, and then once the economy collapses, there's no way again he can improve the living conditions of the rural people and so on. So he's in a tightrope in this case here.
Yes. He
has to improve the economy in order to feed in the people in rural areas, and then also depends, how long are the people in rural areas going to wait again for them to get the benefits of this country and so on. So at least for the average African, especially in the rural areas and so on, to them, well, things are going slow and they're not going as fast as they would like and so on. But for the educated African, at least maybe they can understand Mugabe's problems. At least they could be more patient and so on and try to understand it.
Quite a management task he has in terms of trying to balance off the different competing interests in the country. Well, Mugabe did at independence commit himself to trying to reconstruct and to expand social services in the country. I'd like to perhaps spend a few moments just examining the success that he's obtained in these particular areas, and just how his efforts are viewed by the community there. One of the things that he was talking about, one of the social reforms, had to do with the minimum wage, for example. Nancy, could you perhaps tell us a little bit about what you observed about some of the reforms that have been brought about in the country?
Yes. Well, there was definitely, a concrete difference in the minimum wage. Made a difference to servants. At $50 a month, that in some cases that I know of, tended to double the servant's wage. Education, the amount by which you'd have to multiply the total educational facilities of the country in order to provide, leaving out quality, just classroom space, teachers, and desks for every African is something like 8 to 10 times. So you can't expect that to have been done in this short time. But I think almost every African can see that that appears to be coming. There have been tremendous advances in providing primary education, even though the coverage still isn't complete and there's a great shortage of teachers. Health, it's free health care to those earning less than $150 a month, which again is an improvement. Balanced against that, just to show the difficulties, many people don't live near enough to a doctor or a nurse or a clinic that getting medical help is practical. It would be a long, long walk. So there's definite progress and very definitely a long way to go. But, the people have been helped.
Well, Bruce, going back to this question of the minimum wage, I understand that a year or so ago there was quite a bit of strikes in the unionized sector. The nurses were out. There were others who were protesting that not enough was being done. Is this how widespread is this disenchantment with the progress that's been made? How widespread is it in your opinion? What sector does the unionized people represent? Are they a significant portion of the community there?
Oh, yeah, at least with the workers, quite a lot of them belong to unions because there are quite a number of unions operating under even during this Smith regime. There are quite a number of unions, but at that time the unions didn't have much power, much force as they have now at independence.
There were no black unions during Ian Smith, though, were there black unions allowed?
Yes, there were unions allowed, but
Yes.
they didn't have much clout and
Yes.
they couldn't do much anything in terms of so on. But now, of course, after independence, I guess everybody expected things to improve as quickly as they can.
Yes.
So some of them, some of the unions believe that, changes meant that, you should have immediate pay rises or immediate pay hikes and so on. So some of them, therefore, resorted to strikes in order to get things coming up as quick as possible for them. So as a result, there was a rush of strikes and soon after independence until the government stepped in, at least try to moderate the demands or at least try to maintain things in order. Out of control. Yeah.
Well, Mugabe was quite firm with the strikers. He suggested that their actions weren't in the best interest of the country. Were you inclined to agree with that assessment?
Yeah, as I say, I was inclined to agree with that because, as I said, it looked like at least people tended to look at the independence as come. Therefore, we should have everything that we wanted before independence and so on. But in reality, it doesn't work out that way. At least, things don't have to change overnight, even though independence came. Soon as that. So as a result, I think people were required to try to modify their demands and so on, even though, they had a right to demand those things and so on. But at least since the government was in a tight situation, again, trying to maintain the economy and so on, they couldn't afford, to double at least salaries or overnight like that.
Well, in fact, it's been argued, I think, by some people in the industry that even the minimum wage, by adopting the minimum wage, bringing it up to, I think it's 150 Zimbabwean dollars as the minimum wage now, that in fact was going to, I think some of the capitalists were arguing that Mugabe had gone too far in that respect, that was going to cause some difficulties. So I guess perhaps this depends on where you're setting in terms of how you view these things. Yeah. Well, you were talking about primary education, Nancy. Now, what was the situation pre-independence as far as primary education for blacks was concerned in the country? It wasn't free, was it?
Well, that's interesting. I don't know for sure, but one thing that is certain is that it was not widespread.
Yes.
It was the exception to go to primary education. And what there was for Africans was provided very much by external aid, especially religious mission schools,
yes.
rather than by the government of Rhodesia. And beyond that, taking the number that went to primary education, the percent that went on to secondary and then the percent that went on beyond that, it just shrank and shrank and shrank. Well, for white Zimbabweans, every child went to school, and interestingly enough, every child who started high school, which was almost all of them, finished it was a fail-safe system. I mean, this has been shown statistically that the number that graduated
Yes.
was the same as the number that started in several years of recent history.
Right. Well, Bruce, you perhaps would have, you would be familiar, of course, with the situation pre-independence. Were the schools free for blacks?
No, they're not free at all. The blacks had to pay for the fees. I mean, they had to pay for all the fees, and then pay for textbooks and pay for school uniform and all such things. So it was a difficult situation for the blacks.
So what would that have meant for the average black person? No
So,
education?
For the average, no education at all. Only those who were really determined, or at least who could afford, were able to send their children to school. Otherwise, for the most people, really, they just couldn't afford to send them to school. And it was even worse in the rural areas because there were no schools to begin with anyway, for them to go to anyway. So it was quite a difficult situation, really.
So viewed in that context, Mugabe's move was quite avant-garde.
Oh yeah, in fact, yeah, because since independence now, he has made education free and compulsory. So at least everybody now can go to school. As a result, there's quite a number of school children in the schools and quite a shortage of teachers.
Right. Well, Bruce, I want to ask you a bit about the efforts to Africanize the civil service. I read somewhere that shortly after independence, one of the ministers was calling for the top 25 officials in his department, and with the exception of one, they were all white. How has that been changed since independence?
Yeah, at least since independence, at least the government has been trying to indigenize or Africanize the civil service. In fact, in this regard, Canada, especially Dalhousie University, is involved in this regard, whereby Zimbabwe sends some civil servants here for some training, and then when they go back home, then they get promotions or they can take over some of the jobs that are taking place. So there's been quite some big strides that they made in this civil service. But of course, in most of the cases, things with the Africans before independence, not many of them were in the civil service or in the hierarchy of the civil service. As a result, not many had the experience needed to take over these positions which are vacated by the whites and so on. As a result, there are quite some gaps in terms of the civil service, but they are trying by all means to fill it up to improve the situation.
Well, of course, this would be a direct result of be a legacy of the education system in pre-independence. What about the question, another related question, of course, is the question of skill development for the people in the area. We know in many newly independent countries, and many developing countries for that matter in the world, that there's a lot of dependence on outside skills and technology and so on. What is the situation with this respect in Zimbabwe? What is being done by the government to minimize the dependence of the country on outside expertise and technology?
Yeah, at least the government is aware of this problem. In fact, I would say at least in a way Zimbabwe is lucky that, say, at independence, it had quite a number of Africans that were educated, unlike some other countries. For example, take the case of Zambia. At independence, Zambia had only 2 university graduates. But with the case of Zimbabwe, there's quite thousands of them and so on. Yeah. But even then, we have quite a lot of these. We still have a shortage, especially in the technical side, and the science side, and the medical side, and so on. As a result, the government has instituted a program where they're trying to make a training program of the Zimbabweans. In fact, they are now maintaining a file where they try to contact all the Zimbabweans who are abroad, who have some training abroad and so on, and then try to see what fields they are training in or what fields they are working in and what experience they have and so on, so that they can maintain this record and then to see where they can try to improve the situation. So what happens is they have this big file, and then whenever a ministry needs somebody in a specific field, they go and look in this file and then try to contact that person to come and take over that job. So they are trying by all means to do that.
Right. That's a very important area there, to be able to develop skills. I remember the viewers of our program will remember an earlier program we had with Sarah O'Daddy of the African Studies Center when he was talking about the adverse impact of dependency on outside expertise and technology in many of the developing countries, particularly in Africa. Nancy, back to you. One of the things we didn't discuss when we were talking about some of the reforms that have been brought about was this whole question of land reform. Now, we know that Mugabe inherited a very bad situation as far as with respect to land as a result of some of the obnoxious provisions that were contained in the Lancaster Agreement. Despite that, how has the government made out in terms of its land reform? Can you tell us something about who owns what land in the country and how the government's been able to address the problem of imbalance as far as land ownership in the country is concerned?
Yes. To start with, about half the land is in white hands and half is in African hands. And this is a legacy of a legal legislated situation in Rhodesia where Africans weren't allowed to own it in the better half, and the whites weren't allowed to own the land that was left over
Yes.
for the Africans. The Lancaster House Agreement, which is the basis of Zimbabwe's constitution, says that the government may not take land, it can only buy it from willing sellers. So a land reform program, this becomes very costly and dependent on the willingness of the white farmers. Now in the face of that, the government has instituted a resettlement program and resettled somewhere between 100 and 200,000 people or families. Now, see, I'm not sure. They fell short of their goal, and they have announced a new program with a higher goal, and some fairly informed opinion thinks that it's really not feasible, that they will not achieve this goal. There are various reasons given. One is that there isn't enough land available for sale, another that the land is available but the government can't afford to buy it. The answer could be both of the above. It's a little hard to know, except that resettlement has been going forward, but it is very far from changing the basic situation that the government inherited.
Well, the agricultural sector is predominantly white, is it not? I mean, most of the farms and so on are owned by members of the white community as opposed to the African community?
No, the commercial production is overwhelmingly white produced, but I think if you took the total production, well, I don't know. I would think the African production would have to amount to as much or more. It's just that it's subsistence farming.
Yes.
It's feeding the people who are farming, so it's not in the same category in the economic statistics, where the surplus and what can be sold for cash and exported is the key item usually.
Right. Well, I came across the Riddell, I think it's called the Riddell report, and there were some recommendations in there with respect to land. I don't know whether you're familiar with that report or not, but they were suggesting that possibly land utilization tax, or that in combination with perhaps the government being able to float bonds to purchase land might be part of the answer to getting more land into the hands of the black community. Are you familiar with that report? And do you think that might be some sort of a form of solution to Mugabe's government?
I don't know. I think the other side you'd have to look at is political. On one hand, as Bruce has already pointed out, the government wants to keep agricultural production up in order to help other independent black countries. But they also have the problem that if they were able to take over that much land and, even threaten to be able to produce a thriving or even a self-sufficient economy without the white farmers, I think there might be repercussions from the internal whites and their external allies who would see their status quo threatened. I don't think it's even quite as simple as just finding some system for purchasing the land. There's more to it. And also, isn't the Riddell report also a place where it was concluded that in order to satisfy the African needs, it would require 75% of the present white farmland, and then it estimated the price of purchasing it, however, through floating bonds, and it just seemed totally out of reach. So it might not even be feasible just as an economic measure as you proposed it.
Right. Well, certainly, I think Mugabe deserves whatever praise he can get in the sense that he has a very, very tough road to hoe in terms of trying to manage all of these different factors. I want to turn in the remaining minutes of today's program to some discussion of the situation of women in Zimbabwe. I understand that during the time that you were there, you were able to make some contact with some women's groups and so on. What is your overall assessment of the situation of the women in Zimbabwe?
Well, they're in a markedly lower position than the men, which I suppose is true all over the world. I think perhaps Zimbabwe is one place where that position is only beginning to change legally, while other places, in theory, there's no discrimination. In Zimbabwe, they've removed the race discrimination, but they're just working on women. It turns out to be a very complicated question. For instance, there's a payment that a prospective bridegroom would make to the bride's family called lobola. Well, there have been arguments by Zimbabwean women both for it and against it. The arguments for it would be that it gives the woman a certain status, separates her from a casual woman that the husband might have contact with, a certain security. So it's, you can't, you know, if people's feelings are divided, it's hard to know even what the right law would be. I think it's also, I would want to avoid focusing on the men as a problem. I mean, it is a question of attitudes, and the men to some extent benefit by having somebody lower, but the basic problems I think still goes back to the overall economy. Families are separated because men tend to be in the cities in this pattern, working to earn some cash, and the women running the farm. The women have possibly suffered since independence and by having their children in school, which they ardently support, but that's deprived them of some of their help at home at the same time. I think the position of the women at this point depends more on things such as the land reform and the progress in health care and in education, because they would like to be educated themselves, not just their children. They see them as the next step, themselves as the next step. I mean, these things would do as much or more to alleviate the problem, I think, in the immediate than just the debate over laws and changing attitudes. The problem is very deep economically, unlike, you know, here.
Well, probably that's a subject that we could spend a whole program on, just talking about the situation of the women. I just want to place Brother Bruce on the spot in the minute or so that we have remaining on the program. The situation vis-a-vis the male and the female in many African countries is something that's subject to long-standing customs and cultural things and considerations and so on. What's your opinion, in 20 words or less, about the attitude of the male in Zimbabwe? Are there going to be problems in terms of bringing about some of the changes that are going to be necessary to improve the situation of the women in the country?
I guess it won't be an easy situation. It will take some time. I guess mainly the problem is people nowadays say they want to go back to their roots, go back to tradition and so on. And this is one of the traditional phenomenon, which is this paying of dowry, or where the women have their right place in society and so on is here. But it's a difficult thing to maintain. But I believe that, I mean, things have to be changed. Obviously, the women are in an unfair position, really.
Right.
We have to alleviate some of their problems.
We'll have to have you back, and we'll talk some more about, both of you have you back, and talk some more about the problem of women in Zimbabwe. But I'm getting frantic raps in the background, signal that we must conclude today's program. We want to thank you for watching. Come back next week.